Alright, so pocket doors. Let's start just covering a few of the basic things that you need to know to get started with pocket doors. Number one, these are framed in a 2x6 wall opening. So this is a 6 9/16 jamb. These are 2x4s or 2x6s, which are turned on edge and framed as a split jamb, which gives you a cavity for the door to slide in. Your track goes up here. Framing pocket doors in 2x6 walls is the best practice to me. If you're fortunate enough to be able to use LSL studs, that's even better. You'll get a much straighter and stronger opening. Typically in my demographic, we just use regular studs, and the market hasn't really switched to the LSLs yet. There are kits for pocket doors that'll go in a 4 9/16 wall. They're much lower quality, they don't work well, they really tend to bow out. It's easy to nail into the door accidentally because it's narrower whenever you're nailing on your baseboard or casing or whatever. But as a general rule, 95% of the builders in my market use 2x6 walls for their pocket doors, and that's definitely the best practice. Another random tip, whenever you're having your pocket doors framed at the framing stage, have your framer nail a piece of 2x6 onto the split jamb, and what that'll do is that'll help those studs stay straight throughout the building process. Whenever drywall is applied, for whatever reason, a lot of times these want to bow out, but nailing a 2x6 in the center will help keep that straight throughout the construction process, and then the trim guy can come in and just pull that off and go to town, and things are much straighter. Another random note, I think everyone should have a couple of long bit extensions. I actually went to shoot this video yesterday. I looked up and the framer had left the track out of the opening, and that actually happens decently frequently. So what I'll do is I'll just chuck a couple of these long extensions in, put a bit on with a magnet, and then I'll put my track up in there, and I can actually kind of pry this apart, and I can get my track up in there without removing drywall. So I don't know what I would have done had I not had these, but definitely money well spent that I've had to use an unfortunate number of times. Talking about workflow with pocket doors. So workflow with pocket doors, I like to set all my interior pre-hung doors first thing whenever I get on a job, and then the next thing I'll do is my pocket doors. To me, that's the workflow that makes the most sense. And that way I can still use my same tools for the most part that I've got out for hanging pre-hung doors. It just kind of flows nicely into the pocket doors. After I get my pocket door jambs in, then I'll switch gears to casing my doors and windows, and then case the pocket doors at the same time usually. Getting set to install the pocket doors, I'll do all of my pocket doors at once as far as prepping them for hardware, ripping the bevel off of the edge, and cutting them to the proper height for flooring. So then I'll move all the doors to the openings, which you can see I've got this door right here, and the next step is to prep the opening for install. What I like to do here is use a drywall router, and the reason is usually the drywall is not perfect by any means, and you've got mud and junk hanging over your studs, and I want to be able to put a shim on these studs and make contact the whole way across. I don't want drywall pushing my shims off of the stud. So I find it's just nice to go to all my openings with the drywall router and clean them all up, and then it's just a lot easier to install everything. This is unfortunately very dusty, so a lot of times I'll just do all of my openings throughout the house all at once. That way it gives the dust a few minutes to settle before I come back. The first aspect of the install is going to be to get the door installed in the opening. But before I can do that, I need to determine how far out I want this door to set. Proud of these framing studs because I need a space for a shim in here as well as the 3/4 inch jamb that'll go over the top. And then I want my door to be flush with that. So typically, I'll measure from the back of the cavity to this edge and then add 1 inch. But first I need to make sure it's not horribly out of plumb. If it is, I may need to add a little bit more than 1 inch. This is plumb, so 1 inch should be fine. I've got 32 inches to the framing stud, so I'm gonna add 1 inch to that, so I want 33 inches total. What I'm doing now is determining how much I need to add on to the back of this door so that it sits proud of that framing. So I'm going to take my 33 inches, I'm going to line it up on the edge of the door here, and I'm going to come over to this side, and I'm going to see what it reads. And it reads 1 1/8. So I need to add 1 1/8 onto the back of this door so that it hits the back of the cavity and makes the front edge of the door sit proud of that framing where I want it to. Now these framers don't ever put the bumper in the back of the cavity. Some framers will screw that in the back of the cavity. These don't. So I'll just take a couple of blocks and I need to take 3/8 of an inch for the bumper off of that 1 1/8. So I've got 3/4 inch plus 3/8, that's 1 1/8 inch, and I'll fasten that to the back of the door. The handy thing about having my door kit right here is I'll just grab a couple blocks that I use with my Jam Master out of there, and I don't have to make a trip to the saw. Now if the framer had installed this bumper in the back of the cavity, I'll usually rip a wider piece and longer to ensure that I'm making contact with that bumper. I don't use little stuff like this and hope that I'm gonna hit the bumper. I'll rip something wider and nail it on the back. Just take my 18 gauge nailer about in the center of the door. Don't ever want it coming off, so I put plenty of nails in there. And then I'll need my drill. Take my rubber bumper with the screw in it. Screw that on the back of the door. So that is a cumulative 1 1/8 inch off the back side of this door, which will make my front set where I need it to. Next step, I'm going to take my rollers and install these. The framer should always leave the track about 1 inch or 1.5 inches off of this edge. That way the rollers can be inserted into the opening. So now my rollers are in the track. The next step will be to take the hardware that goes on top of the door and screw it on the top of the door. Here's your roller, and then here's the piece that goes on the top of the door. This is going to insert into here, and then this is going to lock it in. And you see how that pin is locked in there. Now there's a potential problem here because you can actually insert your roller pin in here, and then if this is not seated down in that, it's got its own little groove where it needs to sit in. It'll sit like that, and what'll happen then is you'll install your jams and everything, and then eventually over time someone will slam the door and it'll fall into that groove, and your door's already installed, and that'll throw off all your margins because it'll make the door out of plumb or whatever. So you always want to double check and make sure that that is seated correctly in there whenever you snap that in. You'll also see this nut on here. So your door is hanging on here, and you make your adjustment to plumb the door by turning this nut. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but that's what's going on there. And then this little wrench always comes in your kit with the hardware. So right now I've got to generally always plumb the door. There are situations where I might hang the door a little bit out of plumb. For example, I've got a wall right inside here, and maybe with my casing profile, it's gonna look really bad if I run my casing plumb and the wall's a little bit out of plumb. So I might make some adjustments with the door to make my molding look better where it meets the wall. Obviously out here, I want to be plumb. Another extremely important lesson to understand when hanging pocket doors is to never ever assume that the pocket door track is perfectly level. A lot of times the track will have a hump in it. And what will happen is if you plumb the door here, if there's a hump in that track, over here it'll be out of plumb. So sometimes you have to split the differences. Here I was fortunate enough that I plumbed it here on the split jam side and checked it over here, and I'm plumb, and my sidewall right here is plumb. So I can just leave it as is. But what happens if there's a hump in the track up here, that'll cause the door to actually sit like this. If this is the door, it'll sit like this. But then as you open it and bring it over here, it'll actually change directions on being plumb. So sometimes you have to split the difference. So you can see, you kind of understand that. Sometimes you may be able to shim the track down. It's a lot of work. Sometimes you can maybe loosen a screw a little bit to help you out a little. But that's something that you really always have to keep in mind, because if you only check one side and make it plumb and neglect to check the other side with the door closed, you'll find that you'll get yourself into trouble. A couple things to double check again now that the door is in the opening, it's plumb, we're ready to move on. Make sure that you have the door cut off at the proper height. If it's going to be around carpet, the door should be 1.5 inches off the subfloor. Otherwise, it should be around 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch off of your hard surface flooring. If it's going to have carpet on one side of the door, still needs to be 1.5 inches. I like to lean towards having my pocket doors high because it's a pain in the butt if you have to go back in and take the pocket door out and cut it off. This builder in particular, his framers always have the header height fairly high. That way the casing lines up, which leaves the pocket doors a little bit high, but generally I don't have to cut those off. So make sure your height is set. Make sure your brackets are closed. What will happen is if you forgot to close one of those brackets, kid comes in, flings the door open or closed hard, it'll hit, and then your door will actually fly off of the rollers, and then you got a big problem and a callback to fix later on. The third thing, before you move on to shimming your sides, make sure that the door is centered. So double check and measure from both sides of the door as it's in its closed natural position, and make sure that you don't need to adjust that one way or the other. You want your margins to be equal. I've seen guys who will just put the door in and then they'll actually rip both sides of a split jam a different width accordingly. That's okay, but I would rather have it centered and not have to worry about that. What'll happen is if you're off center and you rip these at a different width, it's possible you get to the closed position and then your margins are different. So I measure both sides and see where I'm at and adjust accordingly. It takes a little longer, but it's just better that way. By the way, this is my favorite pry bar. It's what I always carry with me, and it works great to be able to get up in here and move these rollers into position. Otherwise, it's kind of a pain. It'll also unsnap the little lever thing up there, but I highly recommend this pry bar. All right, we've got our pocket door installed in the opening. We've got it plumbed where we want it to be both sides. We've got it plumbed. We've checked how it's going to land against this sidewall whenever my casing is on. Those reveals are all good. So the next step is going to be to shim the split jam side and the strike side. So we got to shim this, and I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do that.